Hello everybody, Jake Raby here again, Flat 6 Innovations. Want to welcome you back to yet another Rennvision technical video. Now, most of our focus on bore scoring videos were shot in the 2018-2019 period when bore scoring basically exploded. We'd always seen it, but it exploded during this period, especially during 2019. That continued through 2020 and now halfway through 2021. As we revise our content, we're continuing to make sure we're conveying all the right information to you guys out there who are professionals and enthusiasts alike. So what I wanted to do is bring you up to speed with what we've learned since that 2018-2019 period and make sure everything was up to speed with what you needed to know to make good, wise decisions and understand bore scoring. So now, in this video, we're going to go over what causes bore scoring. The biggest question I'm asked on an absolute daily basis and have for at least the last 3 years has been what causes bore scoring. I answer that question every day of my life, whether I'm at the shop or not. It happens because we have that huge question. Submission tickets come through flat6innovations.com constantly because people are alarmed. And it's one of those things where, you know, everything we tell you guys, this is not fear-mongering, this is fact. This is factual information. It's things that we've learned, things that we've seen. And like I said in a couple of our other videos, as we've gone through and revised things, bore scoring continues to explode. It continues to be the absolute leading factor 10 times over that brings engines to us from a failure perspective. As a matter of fact, it's about the only failure we're accepting these days here in mid-2021, post-pandemic. There's not a lot of other failures we're seeing. We see IMS bearing failures, obviously, but the classic examples of massive explosions and things like that, we're not seeing those. People didn't go to the track last year. We didn't see a lot of those massive things, but bore scoring continues to be that big, huge problem. So what I want to tell you is the fact that no one can answer the question, what causes bore scoring? They might like to tell you they can, and they might use a lot of experience that parallels even mine to do that. But at the end of the day, nobody has truly figured out the one thing that leads to it. And the reason why that is because it is a sum of problems. We have a big equation that leads to a sum. And we're going to talk about those things later in this video that we shot back in 2019, and we've revised here in 2021. But I just want to be very clear with everybody and tell you that while we do not know exactly the one thing that causes it, because one thing does not cause it, we do know the major things that attribute to it and the major things that make it accelerate. And that's what we're going to cover as we move on through the Focus on Bore Scoring series. So today, what we've been able to see is more and more engines that we're able to watch over a longer period of time. As of today, we are currently 18 months backlogged with an engine. So this is mid-June actually, 2021. To give you an example, my next available engine build slot for a completion of an engine is currently December of 2022. Now, it's not abnormal for us to carry on these types of backlogs. A lot of times people tell me, you need to add capabilities, you need to add people. No, I don't. We need to keep on focusing on what we're focusing on because we do it better than anybody else because we're not concerned with how many we do, but how well we do each one. And that is the Flat 6 difference. So over all these last couple of years, we've been really focusing on doing case studies. I've been able to spend a lot of time with some particular customers that caught these problems early on before any symptoms were found. They didn't want to have bore scoring, or let's say they were going to do a PPI and make sure they didn't have bore scoring on a car. They found that it did have bore scoring, but it had just started, very early onset. They bought said vehicle, and then they went ahead and got into my engine program, which happens a lot, by the way. And we were able to watch that engine accelerate from used oil analysis, from symptoms, and other things during an 18-month period. And we use those as case studies. We were able to sit back and analyze those. And then about 14 months into that 18-month process, we collect the car. And we take that engine apart and we compare what we see with the profilometer that you see here from a measurement standpoint in each one of those cylinders that were affected, and also the bore scope shots that were found when that engine was found to have bore scoring it did not have any symptoms of, all the way through to the time we collected it. Now, about half the engines that we did end up collecting did have some form of symptom happen before we collected the engine, and the customer was able to kind of get that sixth sense and notate those. You know, the sooty tailpipes, oil consumption, the ticking sound, all that, we had some of those things pop up, okay? While other engines that weren't driven quite as much continued to be asymptomatic for that entire 14-month time period because those folks didn't drive the car as much or they stopped driving it completely, okay? So again, what causes bore scoring is a sum of things, of variables that create that equation that leads to a loss of the piston skirt coating, okay? Or we find that we have a situation where the cylinder has an improper surface finish that will allow it to have particles of silicon and aluminum detach from the bore and start to cause problems. And that can take off the surface finish here, the skirt coating, okay? So there's some things like that that we don't touch in the videos that we've continued to see because such a large percentage of our engine build log has come from engines that have bore scoring. So with no further ado, we're going to get into the previously recorded content that we have revised and want each one of you guys to learn as much as you can about the ailment that is cylinder bore scoring. So the first thing I want you to understand is no singular thing creates bore scoring. No singular thing creates the symptoms of bore scoring. This always has been and always will be, in our experience, an equation of things that happen. When you have a list of variables, those variables will add up into an equation that creates a sum of bore scoring. So the key to understanding something and why it fails is also the way that you are able to avert having that happen. So understanding what fails and why it fails helps us to understand what to do to keep the engine from failing. So first and foremost, the things that really lead to this more than anything are all those variables. So the more those variables that you can reduce through things you learn in this video, obviously, the better your chances are of having better luck. Because at the end of the day, with these cars being as old as they are, they've served for many, many years and many hundreds of thousands of miles, a lot of which may not have been under your care and control. A prior driver or owner may not have taken care of the car the way that we know it should be taken care of today based on this list of stuff that we've been able to come up with. So the biggest piece to this puzzle always has been and always will be controlling these variables. So one of the biggest uncontrollable variables that we have is what the factory gave us. The engine as it stands, as it was delivered in the car, is our biggest variable. Because when we talk about these variables and controlling them, we just can't do anything with what we're given. So here, of course, we have the piston, and the way the piston slides into the crankcase is part of this equation. And this is known as running clearance, or what we call piston skirt clearance. So this is the skirt of the piston where our ferrous stand coating is, okay? We went over that in the first video. And the amount of play, if you will, the running clearance between this cylinder and the piston is one of the biggest variables. So we know with just-in-time manufacturing and automation, robotics, all that sort of thing, the hand is taken out of the equation a lot of times with building engines. And that's just the way modern manufacturing is for every vehicle manufacturer out there. So something that may be caught by hand in some cases, that's a little bit tight or a little bit loose, to an engine builder who's doing things by hand and by feel, would sometimes maybe be left on the table. So we've been able to see with some engines that had early onset bore scoring that the running clearances between these components was less than adequate. It actually made the component heat up a little bit too fast, have a little bit too much friction, whatever the case may be, which might start something to happen. Now, also, later on, we're going to bring the environmental conditions into this, where we always think about people having cold weather applications making this problem worse. That can happen, and one of the reasons why is because of this running clearance. So, to answer that question, running clearances are a key to this equation. Not the problem, but the equation. Okay, so another key here is the materials that are used for the block and for the piston and for the coatings and for all these processes. So again, we have, with this particular engine being in 2002 to 2004 996, it is one of the first engines that had a forged piston from the factory. Now I want you to understand, back in segment 1 where I show the list of engines that were affected, all of the engines that did not make that list as being affected, that are part of the M96 and M97 series, okay, were engines that had cast pistons, being early Boxsters. They just don't score. It's something we very rarely see. I won't say that it doesn't happen, but it rarely happens. When we got the forged pistons, this problem really seemed to come into its own. However, again, it's not the only key that causes the problem, because more changes were made to the engines simultaneously. But the forged piston is part of the materials challenge that this engine has. The second is the localized silicon process for the crankcase. All manufacturers that use this, the European manufacturers that used it over the years, have all had problems with it. Anybody that was using Locasil back in the 90s, early 2000s, got away from it with their newer generation engines. I can't think of one manufacturer that hasn't had significant issues with Locasil. So, one might ask, with this materials and composition, why was that process used? At the end of the day, a lot of this goes to the environment and the way that the environmental protection is in Germany, as well as economics, and the environmental impacts certainly made a big deal for all manufacturers. So the Nikasil process, which we're going to go back to our turbo GT3, GT2 cylinder, and all the air-cooled engines. Remember, this Nikasil, nickel silicon and carbide, was used in all the air-cooled engines. This is a plating process that is very hard on the environment, okay? So it's something that is not environmentally friendly. That's another reason why Porsche got away from it with all the engines in 2013. So from a material selection perspective, we have the forged piston, we have the ring composition, we have the block composition, and we had the Locasil, or the localized silicon, in the cylinders as another variable in our equation. So another part of this equation that you may not have considered is the lifeblood of your engine, and that's the fuel. So I've been working on engines since the age of 8. I had my first paying customer for a Porsche engine at the age of 13. It was for a 914. And over all these years, I've dealt with a lot of fuels. I've dealt with different octanes and race gases. But today's modern fuel offers challenges to engine builders and tuners that we've never had before. And we've been able to directly correlate modern fuels with erosion and problems occurring inside fuel injectors. Now, one may sit back and think, that's ethanol. It's not just ethanol. It's everything in the modern fuels. The additive packages change. Now remember, we also have winter and summer blend fuels in most parts of the United States and also in Canada these days. So every year we get a new fuel mix. The gas station doesn't tell you this. Nobody tells the gas station this. Nobody advertises this. But I can tell you from a tuning perspective that even on old air-cooled carbureted engines, I've noticed the way engines tune. I've noticed on fuel-injected engines how things tune have been much different. Also, DFI engines are responding differently. Because remember, what was new 8 or 10 years ago is also is 8 or 10 years old now. So manufacturers have tried to blend fuels to help with the LSPI, or the low-speed pre-ignition that direct fuel-injected engines are having. So what we're seeing is the fuel today is not made for your car, even if it's 10 years old. It's made more for the most modern car. So modern fuels are wreaking havoc on fuel injectors. And we've noticed that direct link between fuel injectors that are leaking fuel, fuel injectors that have a poor spray pattern, fuel injectors that have been rebuilt poorly and put back into service. All of these are having a big problem with adding to the equation of scored cylinders. This is a Porsche M96, M97 connecting rod. This is also a part of the equation that not many people have really been able to connect. With our experience here at Flat 6, seeing these failures at early onset all the way through stage 4, we've been able to determine that this is another integral part of this equation. Now, rod to stroke ratio is something that is very confusing to understand. And it seems that most times, the more you try to understand it, the more confused you become. So rod to stroke ratio would basically end up being another entire video series in itself that we don't have time to do today. So I'm going to give you a crash course in rod to stroke ratios. So way back, a fellow named Ricardo, his last name was Ricardo, came up with a Ricardo rule. Now what makes the rod to stroke ratio is the stroke of the crankshaft and the length of the rod. That is your equation, okay, that creates that. We can change the ratio and make it more favorable by putting a longer rod in the engine, or we can do what Porsche did with the M96 and M97 engine, and we can make the stroke length longer, which would normally demand a longer length rod to keep that same retention of the proper rod to stroke ratio, or we can go the other way and we can make the rod shorter. Making the rod shorter is usually only done to fit a component within the engine. So anybody that studies engines has heard the name Smokey Yunick. Okay? You might laugh and say, that guy did NASCAR stuff. He learned and he shared and he was able to do things nobody was able to do in his era because of the way he was able to think. So what he said when asked about how long a rod should be in an engine is, put the longest damn rod in it that will fit. And as an engine builder, I've been able to find that on my own as well. So when Porsche put the longer stroke crankshaft in the engine, they had to shorten the length of the rod to physically make the engine be able to assemble, okay? So they didn't want to make the rod long and have to widen the engine as the stroke got wider, because then that changes a whole lot of things in the car. A longer rod ends up meaning that you're going to have a wider engine. Didn't want to change all those things. They shortened up the length of the rod, which was a negative to the rod to stroke ratio. Now, what that does, it impacts the angle that this connecting rod is at different crankshaft positions. It also impacts the dwell time. So earlier in segment 1, we were talking about how the cylinder a lot of times will wear most at bottom dead center, at the very bottom of the cylinder. Well, dwell time plays into that. You have dwell time when that piston is all the way down in the cylinder, and then you have dwell time when the piston and rod is all the way up in the cylinder, and it goes to change over and go back down, okay? Normal operation of a 4-stroke internal combustion engine will tell you that. So the reason why we see a lot of wear on these piston skirts is because of a very steep angle that this piston is operating in, and a decrease in the dwell time at both top dead center and bottom dead center. That makes this piston want to rock in the bore. That puts all of the load on the piston skirt. Now we're going to go over the things that make bank 2 a more pronounced side of the engine to have a problem than bank 1. So now to identify what side of the engine is what. So if you have a 996 or 997, the bank 1 of the engine, which is the less problematic, is on the left side of the car. If you're aft looking forward, it's on the driver's side of the car. If you're talking about bank 2, it's cylinders 4, 5, and 6 on the passenger side of the car. So 1, 2, 3, driver's side, 4, 5, 6, passenger side. Now, I want to let you know that cylinder 4, 5, and 6, the tailpipe, the exhaust from those cylinders is actually on the driver's side. So the exhaust system crosses inside the back of the car, inside the chassis. So cylinders 1, 2, and 3 exhaust on the passenger side, cylinders 4, 5, and 6 exhaust on the driver's side. So a lot of times we're talking about a sooty tailpipe as a symptom, we're going to talk about that a little later on, that is always on the driver's side, or in most cases the driver's side. Or in some cases you'll have a sooty tailpipe on both sides. So as we learn more about this, you're going to learn there are no rules with symptoms. You just have to pay attention to them and take appropriate action. So now, the reason why bank 2 has more of a problem than bank 1 is because the pistons, and this is not just the only reason, it's one of the reasons, and we continue to identify new ones every couple of months it seems, but there is a piston offset. And that piston offset is machined into the piston. So where the piston pin or the wrist pin actually goes through the middle of this piston is slightly offset to one direction. Now the reason this is done is to make the engine run quieter and to reduce wear. Okay? Now key point, to reduce wear. Now, with this particular engine and the entire series of engines, there was one Porsche part number for all 6 pistons. So what this really means is that there was one offset. Anytime the offset would change or some major change happens between pistons that would make it a bank 1 or a bank 2 specific piston, then it would have a different part number. One would be even, one would be odd. One is the left side, one is the right side. That's how that works in the Porsche part system. So with this, there's one part number. That means there's one part. So since we know that we have a bigger problem with cylinder scoring on bank 2, we started paying attention to where the pistons were worn when we pulled them out of the engine. And the way that they were worn was always in a pattern that was opposite of the offset. So what that basically means is, since we had one Porsche part number for this piston for both sides of the engine, that bank 1 had a perfect offset and bank 2 had an opposite than perfect offset because the piston is flipped over for the other side. Now it still says top and bottom on the piston. It still has an arrow that says, yes, this goes toward the flywheel, which allows this engine to be assembled this way. But is that really the best thing for both sides of the engine to have the same offset? So a lot of people think that you have problems when an engine overheats more than anything else. And of course, if you overheat this engine, you're going to warp things, you're going to crack things, you're going to have problems and leave you on the side of the road. What we've learned with this engine is it takes excess heat for a long period of time to create bore scoring. We very seldom see bore scoring come from an engine that has been abused or neglected. A lot of times we see the bore scoring come from garage queen type cars that have always been well taken care of and have also been ran and warmed up. Now let me explain to you. Conventional wisdom has told us since probably the advent of the car that you want to have an engine warm up before you properly go out and drive it, okay? What we've learned is that everything about these cars and about most modern cars is for the benefit of the environment and for emissions. So you can Google the way that the environmental system works and you can Google how the catalytic converters work and all that sort of thing. I'm going to break it down for you very simply. So for an engine to pass a just started type of emissions test, the engine runs its dirtiest when it's first cranked up. Nothing's up to temperature, the combustion process is very poor, so major manufacturers all had to add a couple of things during this generation of engine. One is a secondary air pump. You'll read a lot about that. That is a pump that actually induces air that has not been part of the combustion process into the exhaust system, okay? There's a pathway that it takes to get there, but let's just say that air gets into the exhaust system. The reason why you need that air in the exhaust system we'll learn in a couple seconds here. So the other thing is, when you first crank your car up, if you go to the back of the car and you stand there, you'll smell a lot of fuel, and it may even burn your eyes, especially on a cold morning. The reason for that, when the car first starts, it goes on just started and initial started fuel enrichment. What that means is, because of the cold environment, what the ambient temperatures are, all that sort of thing, when you hit the key, the fuel injection system looks at the coolant temperature, looks to the ambient air temperature sensors, it sees it's cold, it richens up the engine. The reason it richens up the engine is twofold. One, to make it run better when it first starts, and two, primarily to provide fuel in excess that will not be burned completely during the combustion process, so that fuel can also end up in the exhaust system, where it will be mixed with the air that was induced into the exhaust system by the secondary air pump. Now I'm trying to break all this down so you can understand it. So we've got fuel being used in the exhaust and air being used in the exhaust. So why would we need that? Your catalytic converters need cat food, okay? And that cat food is the secondary air mixed with the fuel that was unburned. So the fact that we had to light off these catalytic converters to make them work so the catalyst process can begin is one of the big determining factors of what happens to these engines and a lot of other engines over time. So what we've learned is the Garage Queen cars a lot of times aren't driven in cold weather, but if they are, sometimes they're just cranked up and let run for idle for a while, let the battery charge, all that sort of thing. What we've seen is that does two things. It puts unburned fuel in the oil, which then cuts the viscosity of the oil down and makes it so it doesn't lubricate as well. And two, a lot of that excess fuel goes into the cylinders where it acts as a solvent. So remember that for the catalyst process to occur, you have to have the fuel in excess that the cylinders could not burn thoroughly because they're cold anyway, and you have to have that secondary air that comes from basically the smog pump, if you will. That's what helps to make the catalytic converters do their job to catalyze the emissions process. So the byproduct of the environmental impact that we're trying to negate here is that the engine has a less than stellar operating environment. I can't say that enough. We aren't worried about the engine anymore. We're worried about the environment. And because of that, we've seen wear go up with engines across the board with things in fuels and things like the secondary air and all this sort of thing. So when we talk about this, the key here is that we're bringing more air and more fuel to do that job, but the fuel has to pass through the cylinders to get into the exhaust, okay? With DFI cars, this isn't the case. After 2009, Porsche got away from the secondary air pump, and the way they do it is when the exhaust valve is open, a small bit of fuel is injected into the cylinder that then blows out the exhaust valve and goes into the exhaust system to provide the cat food for that catalyst process to occur. So that's one thing that DFI affords us, is we no longer have the secondary air, and now the enrichment can be changed a lot. But with these engines, we have to work around this. So the best thing that we've learned to do is do not let this engine warm up for an excess period of time. And the reason for that is because the longer the engine runs, the more fuel goes into those cylinders with no load, and that makes the engine take longer to start up and makes it longer to warm up, okay? The key being warm up. So those days of just cranking the car up and letting it sit there and run and warm up so it's more creature comfortable when you get in the car, those things are something we see play into this. So a lot of times we see cold weather cars that have this problem because of the environment, and the environment is what's caused it. You go out, crank the car up, you let it sit there and warm up for maybe 10 or even 15 minutes, so it's nice and warm when you get in, but the problem is it has taken too long for that engine to warm up. Later in this video series, I'll take you through a few steps that you can do to help you understand how you can crank your car up and do it with a little bit more consideration about your engine internals. So the modern fuels we talked about earlier play into this from a couple of perspectives. They play into the entire way the engine goes through the combustion process, and how things have changed with fuels over time have played with that. Now, also, another big key factor that we've learned in the last 24 to 36 months has been problems with fuel injectors, and that's what we see here. So this is a fuel injector like what you would see in a 996 or a 997. They're different colors a lot of times for different flow ratings and that sort of thing. But basically these injectors have a lot of pieces internally that can be affected from erosion and even corrosion, and the things that we see with just regular old mechanical wear. So this injector is mechanical on the inside. It basically has to slice and dice the fuel to cut it into small droplets that actually are able to be atomized. If you ever have a situation where fuel enters a combustion chamber in a raw form, that fuel will not thoroughly burn, okay? Now, that being said, I want to remind you of when I was a kid and I used to build engines. I didn't have a parts cleaning tank. I used gasoline to wash my parts. So gasoline makes a horrible lubricant, but it makes a great solvent. So the problem that we see here is as fuel injectors age and as fuel systems age and as people don't drive the cars as much, the fuel gets older, which attacks the injectors, and all this sort of kind of the equation in its own, the fuel injector starts to deteriorate and starts to go downhill in its efficiency. Now bring in wear with that, and maybe 20 years of service. If your car's a 99, your injectors are 20 years old, the injector is causing a good deal of aggravation with these particular cylinders and the scoring. And we've seen this from engines that have failed. People go in and they try to correct the problem. They don't replace the fuel injectors. The new engine they put in the car, or the repaired engine they put in the car, has another cylinder failure just like it had before, and it's because of this injector. I've helped other companies solve this problem dozens of times. So also want you to understand that you can't effectively rebuild one of these injectors, because rebuilding is basically a cleaning process. It uses ultrasound waves and some temperature and some special solvent that will make these injectors flow a little better, okay? That doesn't do anything for the fact that the erosion, the mechanical wear, and all the things that have happened inside the body of this injector that you can't fix. So the smart thing you do is you throw this injector away and you start from scratch with a brand new one, okay? So rebuilding an injector doesn't really solve this problem. Now, I want to go into the way that the injector can cause an issue and the reason why testing an injector doesn't work that well. So when you have an injector that has a mechanical problem inside of it, the first thing it wants to do is it wants to drip fuel. The second thing it wants to do is have poor spray patterns. So the idea behind this injector is a nice wide spray pattern where all the fuel is atomized, meaning nothing really enters the chamber completely wet, nothing drips into the chamber. So when the injector starts to wear, its ability to slice and dice that fuel and deliver it efficiently is greatly diminished. So that means the fuel enters the cylinder in a raw form where it can act as a solvent. That solvent will then sit in the bottom of the cylinder where it will create wear. It will create corrosive wear and mechanical wear because now it's going to wash off all of the oil that is the protecting layer on the cylinder, if you follow me. The other way that these injectors cause problems is when you shut the hot engine off. So let's say you drive an hour down the road and you shut the engine off. As soon as you shut the engine off, the fuel pressure is still in the fuel rails. The fuel system is still pressurized from the fuel pump. It's this injector's job and the fuel pressure regulator's job to make sure the fuel pressure stays up. If you have an injector that's starting to wear, it will slowly start to bleed. As it starts to bleed that fuel away, the pressure drops. Guess where the fuel goes that bleeds out of this injector? It goes directly into intake ports that may have closed intake valves, or it goes directly into cylinders that may have open intake valves. So if you've ever had a hard time starting your car up after it's set for maybe 20 or 30 minutes and it was hot, the injectors could be causing this, or other things in the fuel system as well. So if the fuel pressure bleeds down over a few days, it will create puddles of fuel that have to set inside those cylinders, and because it's a sealed up environment, the fuel really can't evaporate. So the next time you start your car up, that solvent is acting as a cutting agent to cut that protective layer of oil off your cylinders. And that is another part of this equation that you probably haven't figured out. So the last piece of this puzzle that I want to go over with you is the environment. It's all of the things that we've gone over, plus things we haven't learned yet, and things we haven't even thought about yet, that add into this failure. So that environment, the fuel, the way you drive the car, the way you service the car, the oil you use, all of these things add up to this equation. At the end of the day, it really means that luck plays a key role with this. And I can't tell you enough how much I see people try to avoid problems and get paid dividends for that by using the right oil, by using the right service intervals, by all those sorts of things. There's also times where a car has been driven so long with a certain condition that the damage has been done and it's irreversible. So as we move forward with more segments in this video series, I hope to help you understand more about how to kind of diminish those risks and to, kind of increase the chances that your luck is going to end up being where you need it to be. And at the end of the day, if your luck runs out, I'm going to tell you how to make sure it doesn't happen again. So stay tuned.